I will start promptly at 3 o'clock as agreed. So welcome back everyone from lunch. I hope you had a good time to connect with others, meet new people, connect with old friends, etc. So back for the afternoon session. I think this morning we heard quite a lot in terms of ambition, action, impact, where we should be going, etc. We heard a little bit about the complexities of public-private partnerships, the trade-offs, the tensions that exist within this space. But this afternoon, we want to switch it up a little bit, right? To get into the sometimes uncomfortable space of implementation. That's what I would say. So I don't want to spend a lot of time talking. It's for the panelists and the moderator to do that. But the discussion topic will be beyond pilots, scaling markets to deliver long-term growth and impact. And I always remember a very memorable quote, and you probably have heard it, and the source is always in question, right? And it was from the president of the African Development Bank, and he said, we always have so many pilots. We just want a few of them to take off, right? So something to reflect on. We've heard implementation is complex, but it should not daunt us. So this session is about hearing from those people who are at the forefront and interacting with, again, our colleagues in country offices that are interacting with communities and trying to also do this difficult work. So over to my colleague, Kipkori Koske, the Director for Strategic Partnerships and Policy within the IDF Secretariat. Thank you.
Thanks. Can I ask my panelists to come on stage? I feel lonely here. I have to start by apologizing. Jan is a last-minute addition to the panel. I was going for an all-female panel. Unfortunately, Tuga fell sick. We wish it a speedy recovery, but I think Jan said he's 93% ready.
93% unready.
So 93% unready. Before we start, I just wanted to sort of set the scene. So as actually mentioned, my name is Kipkori Koske from the IDF Secretariat. And I'd like to thank you all, both in person and online, for joining what I believe will be an eye-opening session and a discussion rich in insights from a practitioner's perspective. And I think that's to highlight. This is very focused on the practical and implementation perspective. I believe the panel here assembled is leading truly groundbreaking work in programs coming out of the Sovereign and Humanitarian Solutions Working Group of the IDF. Three key takeaways that I want the panel, but including yourselves as the audience here, to sort of try and contribute to and sort of answer the questions are we creating solutions that work for those who need it most? I think, judging from the panel that we had earlier this morning and the words of Selwyn and Mami, the time for this pilots again is not now. It's time for action and time for implementation on the ground. Secondly, are we ensuring that we're joining up effectively across our shared climate goals? I think the idea of partnerships came out again. This is a truly PPP sort of model that we're going for, but are we doing it as effectively as possible? So there's going to be some uncomfortable questions on that. We're just trying to warn the panelists on that. And then lastly, and most importantly, is scaling those solutions. Pilots, again, we've had too many pilots, we need to take off, and these solutions and the partnerships to ensure that our ambition sort of reaches that level are needed are going to be super important. But before we sort of delve into the panelist conversation immediately, I want to welcome Ulrika Modéer, the United Nations Assistant Secretary General and Director of the Bureau of External Relations and Advocacy at the UNDP. I think Ulrika will come on screen right now. She'll help us in setting the scene for the panel discussion. She'll also share some insights on the need, the demand, and some of the challenges scaling up markets and ex-ante approaches to deliver long-term growth. With that, I'll hand over to Ulrika for your opening remarks. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much for the opportunity. This was actually the first time in a hybrid meeting that I had that fear of missing out when I saw the vivid discussions as the moderator tried to bring it back into the room. So great to have the opportunity to be here at the 2023 IDF Summit, and of course, privileged to join this critical gathering of global leaders and also experts, as you are, to discuss and collaborate on global issues to insurance and risk finance. To enhance what we need is so critical in the world of today, with the financial resilience of the most vulnerable. We have a world with increasing poverty, with increasing inequalities, and 52 countries being so highly indebted that they barely have access to the capital markets. It's a very serious situation. It's also, of course, great to be able to open up with some few remarks at the head of this session, which is focusing on how development actors, private sector and governments can and must work together to, as you said, scale up existing partnerships, scale up what we see actually work to meet the soaring risk and uncertainty that people are facing. As the frequency and severity of disasters are continuing to aggravate, the economic disparity between the insured and the uninsured in the developing world, vulnerabilities will be exacerbated and inequalities will be widened and fiscal instabilities will be amplified. This we see already. So a joint up approach leveraging the expertise of various stakeholders can only be the way forward to address these growing challenges. Developing nations are in, as I said, dire need of this collaboration between the development community and the private sector, and what we can build and offer together with regards to solutions. Developing countries often absorb more than 60% of the global economic disaster losses, 60% in a given year. And since 1980, insurance coverage rate in such countries have often been below 10% and sometimes zero. These are staggering figures. And between 2005 and 2017, 137 billion was provided in development assistance related to disasters, and only 4% or 5.2 billion was then invested into disaster prevention, mitigation and preparedness. That's a really low figure. In 2020, during the peak of COVID-19, the total debt to GDP ratio of developing countries reached an average of 207%. And that's nearly the double of what was recorded during the debt crisis of the 1980s. So I think it's important to have this or bear this in mind. Now, addressing these financial vulnerabilities, economic losses and debt burdens faced by the developing world is, of course, essential to break the cycle of poverty, the increasing inequality, as I alluded to, and then, of course, to achieve the sustainable development goals that we made a promise about back in 2015. And we're halfway there, but nowhere near, as we say. We also need to close the protection gap. So once again, coming together, scaling, and really delivering financial resilience services that works for people is really urgent and, of course, necessary. Public-private partnerships present a pivotal opportunity for sustainable market-based solutions embedded in development planning and governance to foster long-term fiscal stability for governments and for communities. The tripartite agreement between the Insurance Development Forum, BMZ, and 17 of the world's largest insurance, and also then the United Nations Development Programme's Insurance and Risk Finance Facility, is the largest and most successful ideation of this. And you will hear more, as you have now, Jan, in the panel, so that's great. Already operationalized in 22 countries, it aims to offer protection for up to 64 million people by 2025 and deliver new or enhanced sovereign pre-arranged risk financing and insurance mechanism in all program countries. The foundation that we have built through this work throughout actually some few years serves as a platform to build additional capacities. For example, in addition to the 30 million of co-financing from the 17 industry partners, UNDP has been able to further crowd in resources such as partnerships with Milliman that you have seen lately. The UNDP and Milliman Global Actuarial Initiative, GAIN, focuses on developing actuarial expertise and government capacity to develop and deepen insurance markets and build the financial resilience of vulnerable people and communities in the IRFF program countries. And this work is being noticed and we are experiencing demand that we cannot yet match, which is of course great. but more to be done. And in the last year alone, UNDP, through the Insurance and Risk Finance Facility, received requests for similar work from over 35 countries. So here, colleagues across, we have an opportunity that we cannot miss. We also see a growing interest from insurance industry, and in the last year, UNDP entered bilateral partnerships with 4 insurance companies aiming to expand the country offer of UNDP in insurance and risk financing. But much more, of course, to be done. Dear colleagues and friends, it's time for us to come together, as you do here today, and further our joint collective efforts to fulfill the pressing demands that we see. We are gathered to reflect on common ambition, action, and also impact toward a more resilient world in the face of growing uncertainty and risk. And the shared vision serves as a foundation for attracting others who are not in the room with you today or not online, to make sure that we can make a collective effort in scaling the delivery of insurance and risk finance solutions to enhance the resilience everywhere. It is only, and this we know, there's a 17th goal of the Sustainable Development Goals. It's only by working together we can close the protection gap. And you saw how big it is. It's actually unacceptable. And it's only by ensuring this that we can also achieve the Sustainable Development Goals and build a better future for the developing world, but for the world as a whole, as we are all in this together. So very much looking forward to accompany this. We are here to support. You will hear from Jan as well, and he can give you more insights and ideas, I'm sure, as you have a discussion in the panel. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Ulrika. So thank you so much, Ulrika. I think wonderful insights in terms of the way forward. I think this group, and I want to highlight the Sovereign and Humanitarian Solutions groups particularly. When you think about them, you think of a practical and a solution-oriented group. But Ulrika sort of mentioned a few words where I want to sort of touch on. There's a demand in 35 countries, but she also mentioned that we're in 22 countries. So there's a bit of a gap there that we need to fill. But having said that, the SHS group is still a toddler, if you want to look at it from an operational perspective. Relatively young, given under the leadership of Ivo and Claudia, who are looking at me when I say toddler. You've birthed this into a working program, but it's punching well above its weight. In such a short period of time, to be at 22 countries, to be delivering impact across teams, both in the public and private sector, a very, very unique platform to sort of build on. But not to rest on our laurels. We can look at our achievements, but we need to look on the future, and you need to look at the gaps that we need to fill, and not the protection gap in totality, but also gaps in how well our partnerships can work better. So to formulate the discussion, I wanted to provide some context. If we can have one slide, I just had one slide to show. Can we bring up the slide? The slide. There's one slide.
Here's the slide.
Yeah, there's another slide on the top of that. Yes, very, very, very simple. So I just wanted to. People deal in numbers, so I think it's easier to sort of speak about this. The first number, and I got this from a country. I'm not going to say which country. This is going to be a homework for the audience later on when I come picking around who's gonna sort of see which country this is. But the first number is 3.8%. This is the average annual growth rate in GDP terms for that country for the last 60 years. So on average, they've gone through peaks and troughs and everything. So I just wanted to get a very simple average of this is the number. In the same document, there's also that negative 1.7%. That country has put the effect of climate change on its economy and the GDP growth at 1.7%. I don't know about you, but that number is sort of staggering in terms of you look at what does that mean from a development point of view. This country could be going at 5.5% if you look at that. So if you combine both numbers, it's 5.5% growth rate that the country is missing out on. But the most important number at the end, I think that was what sort of struck me. If you look at the 70% there, That's people living below the poverty line in that particular country. And it's stated in its national determined contributions that's filed every year as part of this conferences we go to. But to put it into perspective, these are the numbers that we are actually dealing with. That's 70% of people who need our support, who need us to come together, needs to be put into context and needs to be framed in the right way to actually see how we can support that. With that, and the daunting task of the panelists to sort of answer how we're going to address that 70%, I'd like to quickly introduce my panelists and give them a chance to sort of give a 2-minute reflection. So I'll start right now with Ruth Lux. She's the head of public sector, Europe, India, Middle East, and Africa, and the head of Insurance Development Forum Engagement at Guy Carpenter. Followed swiftly on by Karina Wali, who's the head of public sector at AXA Climate. Jan Kellett, co-chair of the IDF Operating Committee, team and corporate lead at the Insurance and Risk Financing Facility at the UNDP. And lastly, and we're sad not to have her in place, Sumati Rajput, the financial sector specialist and crisis and disaster risk finance leader at the World Bank. Thank you for joining us. So before we sort of delve into the substantive questions that I have for you, Ruth, I think Ulrika mentioned the need to build public-private sector partners to come together. From your perspective and your work within the IDF, if you just could speak broadly about PPPs, how you see them, how you view them from the industry perspective, but also ambitions for PPPs, especially like the IDF.
Great. Well, firstly, thank you for inviting me to be part of this panel discussion. And this morning we talked a lot about PPPs and the important role that they play. So I'm not going to go over that piece of the dialogue. I would like to reflect on the comment made by both Mami and also Yoshi around also taking a step further back and ensuring that we are speaking to the need to communicate more clearly around why insurance is important, and that we're communicating that clearly to the different government counterparts that we're talking to. Lots of numbers have been thrown out around the size of the protection gap, which has grown to $1.24 trillion. And that's especially pressing in the developing world, where estimates of more than 80% of the world's most food insecure people are prone to natural hazards. We heard earlier from the colleagues in the risk modelling panel around the excellent work of the GRMA and the GRII, and I think that really speaks to the fact that there are a number of crucial roles that the insurance industry can play in addressing this protection gap. And that's part of the value behind the PPP public-private partnerships solution piece. Beyond the risk modelling, there's also the loss assessment, the first step in addressing the impact of catastrophes, and also bringing that know-how on how to build back better and incorporate resilience into the different programs that we're looking to design. So really, speaking to what Veronica said this morning around the ecosystem, we find ourselves in a position where we are part of an ecosystem where we can look to harness the collective capabilities of everyone that is not part of just the SHS group, but actually the IDF more broadly, and the landscape that we're in when it comes to trying to design solutions, bringing public and private sector together, the government, international organisations, and the insurance industry. And I'd like to touch on 3 different lessons learned in the implementation of financial protection instruments. So the first one really is around the language of data. And the current supply of risk metrics in international development is characterised by a wide variety of formats and systems. and there's no established standard for the easy transfer of data between platforms, models, and systems. So the net result is that there's no lasting transfer of risk understanding to decision makers, particularly in parts of the world where we are working with the most vulnerable. So that's certainly one of the areas that I think we can tackle, and that will help us remove some of that complexity and also the barriers of cost, and increase that breadth of choice, which I think is really crucial. The second is around the time to implement and the stickiness. And that was touched upon again this morning, and it's certainly something that I think we'll talk about more over the course of this panel. Many of us know all too well how long it takes to establish some of these projects, and once they are up and running, the time that they require to really achieve their full potential. So I'd encourage that with our work with sovereigns and with sub-sovereigns, that we are including these initiatives by also speaking to the long-term nature of them, and that's part of the planning, the policies that are put in place, and that will ultimately increase their long-term durability and their ability to be sustainable over time, so that they really can be fully effective once we've also left that initial phase of setting these projects up. And then the last point I'll speak to is around aligning incentives. So it's easy to talk about public-private partnerships, much more difficult to get into the detail of aligning incentives, aligning timelines, which we spoke to this morning, and delivering results. Given that these institutions are not common bedfellows, building that trust over time is a crucial component, and I think that speaks to the need to align incentives.
Thanks, Ruth. I think you touched on a couple of good points there. Just want to segue. I was going to go into Karina, but I was going to segue into Jan. Yeah. So Ulrika sort of mentioned the 35 countries that are waiting in the wings to take up this offer. We're working in 22 countries. Ruth touched upon the need for this time to act and time to scale. From the UNDP's perspective, and a critical partner of the tripartite agreement that we have with the IDF, the industry, and BMZ, what's taking so long? What's happening?
Are you suggesting that's our responsibility?
No, it's a question to you.
Well, maybe just before,
yes,
like a good politician, I want to answer the question that I'd like to answer. First, I just want to talk about the imperative in a number of different ways, because I think that's important, because we talk about scale, and
yeah,
actually Ulrika mentioned it 2 or 3 times. By the way, Ulrika is one of my 4 bosses. Now, I do actually go back to the time when Ivo, Rowan, and myself were thinking about the IDF about 12 years ago. I had no bosses for insurance. Those were the days. Now I have 4. But maybe that suggests how important insurance risk financing is to UNDP. Well, that's okay. So I just want to focus on scale. Scale is absolutely imperative. Actually, the tripartite, I don't think is a pilot. In fact, actually, some of the initiatives are quite large, policies of 30, 50, $75 million. That's quite sizable. However, in some of those countries, like Nigeria, it's a $50 million policy covering Lagos State for flood risk. That's actually still a fraction of the risk in Nigeria. It's a fraction, and all of the tripartite projects, if you look at almost all of them, given the scale of the economies and the growth, actually the projects, even they're quite substantial, are still a fraction. That's why when we're working together on this idea of a tripartite 2.0, industry, ourselves, Secretariat, we're thinking of not only expanding into new countries, but actually expanding in countries that were already existing, building on the foundation. And that's something we should do because the needs and the risks are outstripping the work. So just to focus again on I just want to focus on 2 indicators of, if you like, need, with which I also extrapolate into scale as well. Because it is true, we had 35 countries or country officers who came to us in 2022 and said, can you do X, Y, and Z? And essentially, we didn't have the resources to do so from within our current financing and staffing, etc. So let's just see what is driving that need. So let's just look at, for example, water scarcity. So the WMO produced a report in December last year that said that in Africa, the African continent, 4 out of every 5 countries by 2030 will not have a sustainable water supply of their own. Now, the consequences of that could be quite catastrophic, let's be honest. I don't use the word lightly. I actually do mean that in terms of conflict over resources, poverty, agriculture, which is the background of African countries, et cetera, et cetera. My question may be back to the financial community, the insurance community, is what can we do? What is our work to actually address that? What does it mean in terms of insurance market development, in terms of sovereign solutions for agriculture and other areas? I think the other one, maybe just as an indicator, is the UN launched an appeal last year for $50.5 billion. $50.5 billion. Now, if that was actually spent from ODA, official development assistance, which is the transfer of aid money from developed to developing countries, that's a third of all ODA just going towards keeping people alive. Now, I'm not undermining the importance of humanitarian assistance of emergency response. Of course, that's important. But is this the model? Is this the model for the future? I think we have to say, collectively, it's not. Certainly we, I think, in the UN family, think very much about that. 10 years ago, when I was doing a lot of tracking of humanitarian assistance, UN appeals were typically about 6 or 7 billion each and every year. Now we're up to 50. Up to about 40% of that is driven by disaster. A lot of it's driven by conflict, but up to 40% is driven by disaster. So again, the question is, what is our response to this? So that's really key. Now, that was the question that I wanted to answer. The question you asked is what's taken its time. So I mean, I would just say I'd come back to some of the things that Veronica. Hello, Michelle. Just to call you out for being here. So I would say Veronica picked up on a number of these things in terms of challenges and blockages and so forth. And thanks for that, Veronica. I think that was really perfect to situate that in the lead-off panel. Because I will just say this from a UNDP perspective, some of this is actually just quite challenging. Quite challenging. Let me just give you one indicator of what the challenges are. You talked about one country, for example, where there was a change of leadership, which caused an issue right at the signing point. Okay, that's pretty important. In the lifetime of the tripartite development, in the 22 countries that were working, there have been 20 elections. In some countries, 2 elections. Now, in each and every case, there's a new administration, which can, in some cases, cause a bit of an issue when it comes to issues of insurance, risk financing. How is it perceived? Too much private sector. Maybe governments are a little bit more socialist in their worldview. How do they see about that? So there's a work of advocacy to do there. And I think in every single case, one of the things which UNDP does, that's part of our job within the tripartite, is work carefully with governments to actually bring those projects back online where they have gone offline. Colombia is an example. Actually, now it has back on track, which is great. Yes, it is.
We're waiting.
Believe me, it is. Another example is Pakistan, which is tricky and has been problematic in the sense of it has one of those countries which stopped because of some of the challenges institutionally, but now we actually think is actually going to go forward. What I'm trying to get to here is that when it comes to the work of actually doing this development, some of it's sort of unheralded. It's not particularly sexy, dare I use that word. It's not sort of immediate. It doesn't flash up upon you, but it's built upon long-term working with government partners and just really working through it. And what I would say as a final point is actually the industry colleagues in all of the countries, I think I'd like to say they appreciate that, but it's that partnership between UNDP and industry and working with government to talk about why this is important, why they should invest on this. This is the political economy aspect of it. That is actually proving to be very successful. So I would say is that we are moving forward, but certainly there's still a lot more to do.
Thanks, Jan. And just to pick up on that, Sumati, I'm conscious that you're waiting. I think Jan mentioned the crisis financing point, so I'll let it hover over you for a second while I ask Karina a question that Jan sort of posed to her. So Jan saying the work is not sexy. It takes a lot of time, but in similar vein, are we providing the right solutions? And what type of solutions do we need to be showing both at the sovereign level and also at the other actors such as the humanitarian level to actually open up the ex-ante sort of thinking of doing work?
Well, I think the most important thing is to go back to the basics, because this has actually come up in one of the discussions ahead of the Macron Summit to some people who are a bit negative about insurance. And the response from BMZ, from Jürgen Sattler, was summed up in one number. I'm going to add to your numbers. And I think it's the entire value proposition of what we're actually trying to do here is you can sum up in the number 6. And that is ex-ante risk financing can reduce the cost of disaster risk financing by up to 6 times compared to ex-post. So everything we're trying to do is, thinking ahead, getting the financing arranged before, coordinating who's going to do what when the payouts come out, figuring out how we actually use the money is actually reducing that cost by that amount. And I think that's at the core of the whole value proposition. And I think in a world of scarce resources, where there's this obviously huge investment still needed just to develop the entire global economy for social needs as well, plus the fact that we've got the growing climate risks, I don't think we can really afford to ignore the chance to use that cost saving of 6 times. So I think insurance is obviously a key part of it. It's not the only ex-ante risk financing tools everyone knows. And what we've been trying to do is to apply at the SHS group is to apply this cost saving to as many actors and humanitarian. We haven't really done a lot yet, but I mean all the different sovereign, sub-sovereign, agriculture, public assets, emergency response. We're trying to apply this value proposition as widely as we can. But my hope is that we can actually get it further. So we've got agriculture programs in Mexico. We've got the Lagos flood structure that's starting up in quite soon for emergency response. But I think there's this entire world that we haven't even started scratching the surface, which is SMEs. I think World Bank is trying really hard to get that through. Is the small economies, we haven't even started to think how to approach climate insurance for them. Utilities, you're talking about water scarcity being a big issue. I mean, what are water utilities going to do? How are their risk financing means? What can they really do about it? And then equally the humanitarian sector. So I think where we can move really quickly is where the governments are typically middle income, upper middle income. They're well versed on ex-ante. They've had insurance in the past. They understand the value proposition. There's stable leadership. There's not a change every few years and who's driving the country. And I think we've seen this with Mexico, who was here last year. They actually came to the IDF seeking support for the reincarnation of their agriculture insurance program. And then where things are getting stuck is basically the opposite, where the understanding of the ex-ante value proposition is really nascent, where the governments are changing constantly, leadership is lacking, and where the financing is extremely scarce. So all the LDCs, all the poorest countries, where you're trying to speak to them about indefinite, heavy premium subsidies, that is like this huge fiscal burden. I mean, how do you even try and talk to a government who can barely pay the basic bills? I think we saw that with ARC as well. So I think even in middle income countries, the understanding is not necessarily there. So with Thailand, I mean, we've been in discussions for over a year and a half. Discussions have just come to a grinding halt because they're not convinced of the value of money for insurance compared to risk reduction investments. And for them, it's an either or. And they've also not yet faced up to the question of the very extreme events. They think that whatever reserve funds they have in place has been doing just fine so far. And they're not thinking about what's coming and how they're going to finance that. And I think even the 2011 floods is kind of a fading memory now. So I think what's been good is that the Insur Resilient Solutions Fund, the UNDP, has been absolutely incredible to try and get through some of these obstacles. I think we've had the UNDP helping us in most of the projects, not all, but most of the projects to get engagement at top level, sovereign level, because you have to get everyone on board. So that's been critical because as a private sector, you really can't be interfacing with the government directly. You've also been really amazing at translating the value proposition into the cultural and local context. A lot of the sub-sovereign teams that we're working with, for instance, in Vietnam, they don't speak English. We can't even have direct conversations. And then there's all these codes about how you say things, what kind of communication. They're not on WhatsApp. They've got their own system of messaging each other. It's a whole new world. And then trying to embed the potential solutions in what exists already. Inter-Resilient Solutions Fund tries to do that with Concept Note to try and say what's there, how is your solution going to really be part of what's already in place. But I think we can do much more. And then critically, ISF has been really amazing in offering the premium support for the first few years at least. So my hope is that the Global Shield is going to be able to go even further to really reach the breadth and scale that's needed. Because I think, when I've looked it up, it was a $1.4 trillion protection gap, thanks to Sisri's calculations. So I just think that means, I think Veronica had said it, it's all hands on deck. It's public sector, but Global Shield on speed. We need it 10 times bigger than it currently is being financed, plus all the private sector resources. There's a handful of us who are already working on this. We need to treble that, times that by 10. I don't know who's going to pay for that, but we need more, and I think it's possible.
Thanks so much, Karina. I think all hands on deck, and you lead off quite well to Sumati from the World Bank. An important part, Ethiopius was here earlier on talking about the virtues of sort of working within the IDF, but I want to sort of draw your attention to two things. The first one, what Jan mentioned earlier on the crisis financing sort of point. It's a big year for the World Bank with all the changes that are happening, but also I think there was an announcement last week. It didn't get as much traction as the organizational changes, but it did. There was a World Bank IDA facility for crisis financing was seeking money and was seeking calls for donors to put in some funding. Importantly, it did say the facility wants to leverage the private sector. So Sumati, just on that, how do we all bring everybody on the deck and sort of supporting and leveraging the private sector with some of the country work that we're doing within the bank?
Thanks, Kip, and can you hear me well?
Yes, perfect.
All right, I can hear my echo, but I will try to power through. Thanks so much for giving me the opportunity to actually share the bank's experience at this important event and also talk about some of these really important issues that many of the panelists have actually already highlighted. Over the last decade, of course, I know that you're talking about an announcement that was made last week, but of course, I would say that we've been working on this agenda now for many years. And so we can't see one announcement in isolation on how country engagement works and how we leverage the private sector in many different ways. So really over the last 10 years, of course, we've been working in over 70 countries on strengthening their kind of financial resilience. And really we follow a very tested approach when we work with countries, which is really centered around understanding what countries want and need, and then developing targeted solutions that respond to those requests. Of course, the private sector is critical in terms of implementation because, they really offer kind of the reinsurance capacity that most developing country markets need. Now, when we work with countries, it's a very long process, and Jan and Karina and Ruth all kind of alluded to this very well, because it's really a process that requires a lot of patience and it requires a lot of listening. And we use many of the tools that we've got in-house to actually work with countries to help them understand their own financial protection gaps through our country diagnostics. And then eventually this enables them to develop their own protection priorities and their own set of risk retention and risk transfer solutions that they want to put in place. Because of course, insurance is one piece of the pie. And it's definitely needs to be surrounded by not just financial instruments of other nature, but also of a whole ecosystem around kind of making these work. And just in terms of the way that we work with countries, we actually work with them in all of their kind of journey. So it's getting the right kind of institutional structures in place. And this often requires quite a bit of policy dialogue, technical dialogue, and then really working with them on providing the needed finance and capital in terms of premium support, yes, capital support, yes, but also, there's other costs associated to developing and implementing these solutions, which are around the startup costs associated to instruments, as well as the funds that are needed to make sure that all the public financial management systems are in place to ensure that money actually flows when these instruments are triggered. And we've now been working in over 40 countries, in terms of this process. More than 30 actually have accessed policy instruments that are strengthening these institutional structures and making advancements on kind of the strengthening their financial discipline as well. Through the Global Risk Finance Facility, which again is obviously part of, which is evolving as the Global Shield Finance Facility and very much part of the Global Shield. And there's now 18 country programs where there's these, there's this consolidated dialogue on the institutional mechanisms that are needed, the risk retention solutions that are needed. And of course, the private sector here is playing a key role, because through the GRIF and through other programs, over 8 billion in private capital has been enabled. And this is really because this is the risk that's been transferred to financial markets through reinsurance and through cap bonds. And really, this is pivotal because this is needed for developing country markets to be able to offer protection to country budgets, businesses, as well as SMEs. A quick word, I'll talk quickly about the conflict side, and maybe I'll take the case of sorry, you asked about the fragile side, and I'll maybe just illustrate through one example, in one country example. Really, in the country of Mozambique, we've actually been working for almost 10 years. We started the dialogue right from the time when they wanted to put in place legislation to enable financial kind of solutions. And that process itself took over 5 years. And now the country, several years after that, has 3 instruments in place, one to protect kind of their budget through a budget allocation each year, and then 2 risk transfer instruments that are now in place to really, be able to respond to cyclones, as well as the other instrument is targeted to precipitation. And this really demonstrates sort of the journey that you need to go. It's not different, be it in a fragile context or be it in any other context. It takes time, and it takes a lot of patience. And of course, as part of the Global Shield, as part of all the changes that are coming about within the World Bank, we remain committed, to respond to what countries need and want, and work as collaboratively as we can with all different stakeholders, including the private sector, including humanitarian partners. I could go on, but I think I'll pause here, just in the interest of time.
Thank you, Sumati. As a bit worried when you said 10 years, I think Rowan mentioned that we have a 2-year maximum time to sort of ensure that we get things off the ground. So on the same vein, and back to Jan on embedding this programs within governments and ensuring that they're sticky, as Ruth sort of mentioned. Resilience building and policy formulation is bread and butter for UNDP. How do you see this in terms of not only the tripartite, but in general, how the industry can contribute to that conversation? Because I think from the industry's perspective, we see it from the idea that we need to sort of get the solutions out. But I think we just paint a picture for us in terms of how that works and how we can sort of contribute to that discussion.
Thanks, Kip. Well, I think actually I'm going to go back to the first panel as well today, because I think we heard it from Ethiopia's Veronica and Julian, all in different kinds of ways, how the financial product is only one part of it. I think we got that quite strongly from all 3, which was very pleasing from a UNDP perspective. Because it is true, financially protecting people, whether it's an individual insurance product, protecting some aspect of my life and living, or it's a sovereign solution, for agriculture or public sector. These are really important. It's great. This is absolutely critical. We've heard in all of the panels about the protection gap, and I think we'll hear it tomorrow from Catherine, from microinsurance network about the personal protection gap, which is the term they're using about more people, more people-centered protection gap, which is very prevalent in developing countries, and actually everywhere, but particularly perhaps. So it's actually interesting. I'm going to suggest that actually we in the UNDP and other development partners over the last 10 years have actually helped the insurance industry become very comfortable with this language. I'm not sure 10 years ago, prior to the IDF, prior to the Insure Resilience, I'm not entirely sure, Rowan, maybe get a question or comment from later, whether or not that was kind of part of your language. Apart from anything, we weren't necessarily speaking together. So actually, we weren't necessarily having these forums being able to discuss. So I think that itself is an amazing journey. So let's just commend ourselves collectively for having got to this place. And of course, for UNDP, this is fantastic because our interest is actually in development. Go back to one of the first IDFs we did in Singapore. One of the comments I made at an event was I said, actually, UNDP doesn't really care about insurance. I don't care about insurance at all. What we care about is development. And we finally realized as a development partner that actually insurance is pretty critical to development. That sustainable part of the SDGs is not sustainable without financial resilience. But I would say prior to 2015, 2014, that was a little bit of a limited understanding with a few colleagues across the entire of our 20-odd thousand staff in 170 countries. So we have moved a long way. So we see actually now insurance risk financing as central to development, increasingly so. There is a reason why the administrator is co-chairing the IDF. There is a reason why the tripartite features in the annual report, while insurance and risk financing features in our strategic plan for the first time. It is not an accident. It's not just me annoying everybody inside UNDP. It is partly that. But it is about how it's become fundamentally part and parcel of what UNDP sees as being sustainable development, tackling poverty reduction and tackling climate change, those two particular nexuses, if you like. Then moving on to, well, what does it mean practically? Well, actually, I think Veronica said quite a bit of this morning, and also other colleagues. I'd probably break it down into three main parts. One is it Ministry of Finance capacity. We've talked about that a little bit partly to understand and analyze risk. That's where the work of GRMA and our initiatives to analyze risk and bring risk modeling into government is really key. What's the Ministry of Finance capacity to understand the financial products that are being developed by the tripartite and other partners? Do they have the capacity to position that? How does it fit? There's the political economy of that as well, making choices. That's all in and around what the Ministry of Finance is doing. So there's a big part of the work there. The second is indeed insurance market development. So it's not just about the sovereign solutions, if you like, but actually about everyday experiences of risk and what that means to your family, to your community, and to your business. That's where we must indeed see insurance market development, because not all solutions can be sovereign. We absolutely know that. And then the third thing is the integration of insurance and risk financing into all of the ways in which governments are already trying to tackle with these very significant problems. You alluded to them in terms of the fiscal issue is very key. Public financial management. What about NDCs? What about NAPs? What about post-disaster needs assessments? I think it was commendable, for example, Pakistan, which, as you note, has just seen a massive flooding. I was there for a couple of weeks in March. Massive flooding, I think it caused $32 billion of damage. That's just one flood. That's just one flood. I wonder how much of that is insured or protected. 2 or 3%, to be very frank. I think insurance penetration vis-a-vis GDP in Pakistan is 0.9%. 0.29% of that is non-life. So you can just see as an indicator. Public sector insurance, there are institutions in place, but how much is actually protected? So of that $32 billion, very little of that was insured. But very commendably, Pakistan has put insurance and risk financing into the heart of the 4RF. The 4RF being the recovery, rehabilitation, reconstruction, and I've forgotten the other R. Which is a $16 billion program. So it's put it there, and it's commendable that it's done so. And it's really looking to the future about putting ex-ante solutions, whether the sovereign, sub-sovereign, or down to the family level, into the way in which the country looks to the future. So what I'd say is, just as a sort of a summing up point, really very happy with our journey that we've got to. What I would say is that we haven't necessarily quite harnessed all of the industry potential. We've done some around the modeling side of things. I think that's there, but hasn't really penetrated into government, the heart of government in many places. That just the sheer number of challenges that governments have right now with rising risk and debt burden, etc., is just so immense. How can we do that? And this is what I would say: utilize ourselves in UNDP, our friends in the World Bank, as conduits to do so. But there's also a lot of other expertise which the insurance industry can bring. Ancillary work, for example, looking at engineering and other ways of earthquake risk and modeling. I think that there are other things which we can definitely do together, and we need to see much more of that.
So it's a question to the industry folks on the panel. So what does UNDP need to see from you? But also I have to caveat that by saying that Karina and Ruth, both teams are, I think, carrying the majority of the weight within the tripartite agreement with, I think, 14 each or 13 or 14 each. 15, sorry, I got that wrong. So, and it speaks to the level of our ambition, at least from the industry side, but also from the UNDP side. Are we doing enough in terms of the solutions? Are we doing enough in terms of the scale that we're going at? Because Mozambique has 3 products on different levels, obviously relatively small. Do we need to sort of coalesce and bring that into one gigantic sort of program for Mozambique to sort of cover it across the industry and across our public partners? Question to you, Ruth. What do we need to do to reach that ambition?
Yeah, thanks, Kip. And just picking up on what Jan said, I think, look, there's an awful lot that is taking place in country that we could really build upon. And that is part of where industry can still continue to lean in more in dialogue with UNDP and with government, and where we're seeing these country projects have real traction. I think we can build on that momentum and build on those efforts and look to continue to embed ourselves further. So that's certainly part of an answer to that question around scale and ambition. I mean, the reality is that on average, the world's low-income countries lose $29 billion every year from disasters, and just 3% of those losses are covered by insurance. So we can be an awful lot more aggressive in putting this expertise to work. And we've talked about a number of the different areas that insurance can play in, and I think picking up on what Karina said earlier and that you're alluding to, this really is an invitation to all other colleagues in the insurance industry to lean into that collective effort, because we all need to roll our sleeves up and ensure that there are more of us around the table who are committed to doing that work. A lot of the work that we're doing is at a country level, and there are lots of discussions that are being had with our UNDP colleagues and with the World Bank around how we can also look at what can be done at a sub-sovereign level, what can be done at a regional level, how can we really look to expand at pace and build that out regionally. And also with the Sovereign Humanitarian Solutions Working Group, there's an awful lot that can be learned from our humanitarian colleagues. And I think we need to lean into that relationship and better understand how they're working on the ground, the experience that they have from being part of those solutions, and look to learn from that. And then there's another piece there around innovation. And I think what we're seeing is that there is an awful lot of innovation that's happening around product development, but there's space for more. And that opens up an opportunity to have more scale in the types of products that we're developing and the types of countries that we're working within, and to propose very different solutions for the range of risks that we're facing.
Perfect. Karina, quickly to you. You mentioned premium financing. I know it's a key concern for most, if not all, here. We usually have financing or some sort of premium financing for a finite amount of time, usually 3 to 5 years, and that's when the pilot sort of comes down. In an ideal world, what would premium financing look like to you? Yeah.
Well, I think we've got in the audience here Mr. Chafai from IPSEC, who I wish had come on stage to speak, or maybe
Please.
Perhaps tomorrow, because so essentially Morocco has been absolutely incredible in setting up this catastrophe solidarity fund for the most vulnerable population. They've got a huge parametric earthquake cover that is for emergency response for the most vulnerable. And it's sustainably financed through a tax, which is obviously taxed not to those people, to the other more wealthy individuals. I don't know details of how exactly the tax system works. Obviously, it works in Morocco because it's not, the most extremely poor country. But I think, having those kind of structures in place. I mean, if you would like to discuss it a little bit, I think this is a really key point. Non, c'est pas grave.
Parfait.
I hope you're sitting next to a French person to translate for you.
Merci. Bien, effectivement, donc on a démarré en 2020 un nouveau système marocain. Donc c'est un système qui est mixte, un système assurantiel et puis un système de solidarité. Pourquoi on a fait ça? C'est le faible taux de pénétration au niveau de l'assurance. Nous sommes sur un taux de pénétration, comme ça a été cité, il est faible mais il est relativement correct, de 3,6-3,7%. Et nous avons pour les habitations et pour les personnes des taux d'assurance relativement faibles. Sur les habitations, on est en moyenne 7%, donc ce qui est relativement faible. Et sur les dommages aux personnes, nous sommes à peu près à 60%. Donc faire un régime purement assurantiel pose un problème puisque nous n'allons pas répondre à la majorité de la population. Et puis on va trouver que les personnes les plus vulnérables avec des revenus faibles, ce sont les personnes qui ne sont pas assurées. Et donc là, on va dire les effets de la catastrophe, la vulnérabilité va encore être plus forte. Donc le régime qui a été imaginé, c'est de faire payer une taxe supplémentaire sur les contrats d'assurance. C'est une taxe de 1%, donc il n'est pas énorme, donc 1%. Ces 1%, ils viennent au Fonds de solidarité, donc, qui est opérationnel, c'est sa 4e année, et le fonds qui va indemniser les personnes non assurées. L'indemnisation pour les personnes non assurées, elle est relativement moins réduite, à peu près de 30% par rapport à quelqu'un d'assuré, pour garder un intérêt sur l'assurance et ne pas drainer le système, on va dire, assurantiel vers le bas. Donc il faut quand même l'encourager, donc c'est ça le plus important. Et puis, il y a des plafonds, et les plafonds qui ont été choisis, c'est quelqu'un qui a un logement social, il sera indemnisé à hauteur presque de 100%. Donc, lorsqu'on a un logement d'un certain standing, effectivement, ce plafond-là va réduire, donc de telle manière à mieux adresser les populations qui sont vulnérables. Sur ce que ramène cette taxe au niveau du fonds de solidarité que je gère, cette taxe ramène 25 millions d'euros par an, suffisamment, c'est intéressant. Sur les 25 millions d'euros, donc, on a démarré avec zéro, donc avec des fonds propres égaux à zéro. On a juste signé on va dire, un cas DDO avec la Banque mondiale en cas d'urgence. Donc, on a l'argent pendant une période, je pense, de 7 ans. Donc, ça nous donne un financement qu'on pourrait déclencher au bout de 30 jours et ça permet de réduire les besoins et peut-être, au-delà. Donc, si jamais on va dire, les actifs du fonds sont suffisants, on espère qu'on n'aura pas à renouveler cette solution. Donc, pour aussi, on se retrouve avec une garantie illimitée, puisqu'on indemnise tout le monde, mais avec des ressources limitées. Donc, il fallait un petit peu trouver des solutions financières à la problématique. Et les solutions que nous avons mises en place, c'est une solution de couverture paramétrique. Donc, nous, on n'a pas un détail au niveau des personnes qui sont assurées. Donc, on n'a pas de détail, on n'a pas de police d'assurance, comme dans une compagnie d'assurance. Donc, on a toute personne qui n'est pas assurée, elle a le droit à une indemnité. Donc, on a travaillé pour avoir des ressources indépendantes on va dire, de l'exposition que nous avons, mais on a minimisé le risque de base et on a mis un contrat de couverture paramétrique tremblement de terre pour le moment. Et nous travaillons sur une inondation. La problématique de l'inondation et les doubles que nous avons, c'est une problématique on est dans une région, l'Afrique du Nord, c'est beaucoup plus de flash flood. Donc la durée de présence de l'eau est relativement réduite et les couvertures paramétriques posent problème. On est en train de réfléchir à des solutions, donc un petit peu à utiliser des sensors, utiliser des choses comme ça pour pouvoir avoir une couverture paramétrique inondation. Et avec cette solution, nous estimons qu'on peut atteindre à rembourser les personnes qui seraient victimes de catastrophes à hauteur des événements qui ont une période de retour de 100 ans, ce qui est quand même relativement confortable. Et par la loi, nous avons la possibilité de réduire les indemnités lorsque les ressources sont insuffisantes, donc pour garder l'équilibre financier du fonds. Mais on s'est engagé à ne pas utiliser ça si l'événement il a une période de retour de 100 ans. Donc voilà, donc on a trouvé le financement, donc on a trouvé les solutions dans les solutions paramétriques pour trouver ça. On a fait appel à la dette. Et puis on peut dire que notre couverture des engagements, donc on va dire il y a une ligne fonds propres, une ligne de la dette, une ligne de la couverture réassurance. On travaille sur la réassurance. Nous n'avons pas pu souscrire à hauteur de la capacité que nous souhaitons. Donc, comme je dirais, sur la période au niveau des 100 ans. Et on est en train de travailler sur des solutions alternatives et faire appel au marché ILS. Voilà.
I hope Karina can translate that.
Well, in a nutshell, I mean, the big figures, it's, the fund has got a tax on insurance contracts, has managed to raise $25 million euros per year, and also has a CAT-DDO contingent debt facility through the World Bank. And I think they're adding flood in future as well. And I think this model can be served in other similar countries. I don't think it'll work in extreme, very, very poor countries, but it definitely can be thought of as a sustainable way forward. Beyond that, I think in terms of premium financing, we should be looking potentially at, I know I'm not supposed to maybe talk about it, but loss and damage funds, can something like that be used to help the most poor countries to actually indefinitely finance a portion of the premium over time? I think that has to be part of the solution. I've got other things I want to say, but I'm running out of time.
Before I get shouted at by the Swiss organizers, I know we're almost out of time. Do I have time for one question, or are we? We've got 3 minutes. Apologies. Questions from the audience. I want to make sure that Ken, please. Can I get a mic to Ken?
So I'd like to focus on Karina's number 6. So if we think about how do we actually accomplish that 6 times improvement in efficiency in reducing the cost of addressing a disaster, we talk about the difference between ex-ante financing and ex-post financing for disaster risk reduction. Just like your comments on a potentially radical concept that the two, ex-ante and ex-post, may be fundamentally incompatible because the decision makers who are deciding not to participate in an ex-ante system are thinking that by doing so they would forego benefits from an ex-post system. But if they received a clear communication that the ex-post system is over, that would change their decision-making process, and we would flip to a new equilibrium that would be fundamentally in a different place. So please let me know your thoughts on that.
That's an amazing question. Any other questions? One more question.
Any other questions?
And then we close it. No questions. I'll ask.
Can I have one response?
Yes.
I mean, I'm probably not the person to answer that question as coming from the private sector insurance company, but I think that's exactly what is needed. But politically, it's so dangerous. I don't know if anyone would be prepared to make that kind of bold move. Because imagine that would be shutting off humanitarian financing ex post and saying you have to have it all prearranged. So I think, theoretically it totally works, but trying to get that actually put in place, I think will be really, really tough. But, and I did want to mention it, the UNICEF deal is exactly the kind of things that maybe instead of the kind of the stick where you block off that option, you have the carrot of showing the proof of concept to show what ex-ante could look like. I don't know if everyone's aware, but UNICEF has done this incredible deal. Hurricane parametric over 8 countries. It's already got 5 cyclones that have triggered. If you see those proof of concepts, maybe that can make the shift.
I mean,
Very quickly.
Well, I would just say, I mean, I don't think we're there yet, Ken. I mean, to be honest with you, there's such a vast way to get there. I don't think we need to quite worry about that. What we need to do is to get something into maybe just focus on the humanitarian. I will focus on this $50 billion of humanitarian appeal from the UN at the end of last year. What can we do to actually shift some of that? There are a few governments, I think Germany, for example, money which is controlled by the Foreign Office, which is that's where the humanitarian budget, set themselves a target of 5% should go towards ex-ante. Well, that's great. Why not all of the donors that do that? If we're going to have $40 or $50 billion each and every year go towards humanitarian assistance, why don't they set themselves a target and say, do you know what, 5 or 10% of that, we're going to want ex-ante solutions. Some of the work that like UNICEF is doing, anticipatory financing, work on parametric insurance, ways in which we can get finance into communities and countries much faster, more predictably, and indeed cheaper. And just as a note, some of the wording on the loss and damage transitional committee and the report, insurance and risk financing, is all over that document. So let's see what comes out in the future.
Thank you, Jan. And with that, I think we can come to the end of the session. I think we've had quite very interesting views. I loved Ken's question. I think it's something that we can discuss in the networking sessions and in the dinner as we go and speak about what does it mean to think boldly and to think differently. I think it's a very nice way of closing this session, because we've achieved so much with the constraints, the policy and the advocacy constraints that we have, but we sort of need to push the envelope a bit more and start thinking a bit differently. And I think it's a nice plug to say that there's a crisis financing session happening straight after this, which is going to delve into some of those issues. I won't say all of it, but we have some government representatives who are going to be there. And just to note, as part of Ken's question, Ivo has a tough job this year. We've tasked him and the SHS leadership to move at least from the current 2% ex-ante planning for finance to make that into a 5% number. So there is thinking happening around that, but it's a growing piece of work for us and the IDF in general. So with that, I'd like to quickly thank my panelists. I think the conversations have been great, but they're the first of many. So looking forward to connecting and engaging with you guys afterwards at networking session and the breakout sessions as we go along. So thank you so much. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Kip. I don't want to delve into the things that have come out of this session. I think it's been very interesting in terms of giving us a feel in terms of implementation and the challenges around that. A couple of lessons. I would say next time, perhaps for the IDF Summit, we will have translation. So thank you to Mr. Shafai for his intervention, and obviously to Sumati for joining us and the patients. So hopefully you'll be able to be with us physically. And with that, I would just like to, as Kip said, provide you with some logistical information. We're now moving to the breakout sessions where we get a little bit more in depth in terms of some of the things that have emerged over the last few hours. So there are 3 sessions. The first is improving and understanding access to climate and disaster risk analytics and financing tools. That's in room F006, which is on this level. And that's the risk modeling working group. I think Nick has done enough to plug that. So the second is crisis finance. Second is building coastal resilience from ambition to action and impact, which is being led by our colleagues from Aura and Chip Cunliffe, and that is in room F005. And then obviously the third one is on crisis financing, which is in F101, which is on the floor above. So I will, invite you to join those sessions. We should end at 17:35? 25, sorry, and we will resume at 17:30. So thank you for that, and let's continue the conversation. Okay.